right, well, it looks like we are ready to get started. So as the rest of our guests join, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. First, we are recording this session and it will be available for viewing after the Congress within 2 weeks. If you'd like to ask any speaker questions, feel free to do so in the Whova chat to the right of your viewing window. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off unless the presenter asks you to turn them on. It looks like we're ready to get started, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our moderator. Kevin, if you want to kick things off, we're all set.
Okay, thanks so much. My name is Kevin Robertson. I'm the Fire Ecology Research Scientist at Tall Timbers Research Station. I'll be the moderator today. In our first presentation is going to be by María Rosa Mosquera-Losada, and she's a distinguished professor and coordinator of the doctoral program in agriculture and forestry research at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And she's going to be talking about prescribed fire and grazing by horses on soil carbon in Spain. Rosa, would you go ahead and share your screen, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I will. Pantalla. So, are you seeing my screen?
We do. It looks great. And Rosa, if you want to turn your camera on, then we can see you present as well.
Yes, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to acknowledge and say thank you very much for allowing me to make the presentation of this European Union project. I'm María Rosa Mosquera-Losada. I am full professor at the University of Santiago de Compostela, and this work was carried out with Nuria Ferreiro Dominguez and Antonio Regueiro Rodriguez. Both of them have been worked for many years in the prescribed burnings, and mostly in silvopasture in Europe. This is the title of my presentation is the effect of the prescribed burnings and silvopasture on the carbon in the soil fraction in Galicia, northwest of Spain. This experiment was carried out in Galicia, but also is replicated in different countries of Europe, such as and different environments, Portugal and France. Okay, Europe is facing with a lot of very important challenges, like for example, the strong aging of its rural areas. People is getting old, and we don't have replacement for these foresters and farmers in the rural areas, which is a very big challenge for us. Therefore, and due to this, we have a lot of unmanaged forest lands in Europe and a rural abandon of the area. In concrete, Galicia is the area of Europe that has a highest risk of forest fires, and that has the highest number of hectares that fire every year, that we can count for between 50,000 and 70,000 hectares, with peaks of 100,000 hectares of area that are fired in a year. Well, land management facilitation is key to attract young farmers and to manage these forestry to the forest areas, just to reduce this forest risk. And this is the main aim of OP2 Preserve. It is based on three main topics, which is the combination of prescribed burnings and silvopasture. We know it as pyric herbivorism. The use of autochthonous breeds, because they are the ones that are better adapted to these forest lands and to use the vegetation it has there. And in the identification and promotion of innovative solutions of valorization of the products that come from the livestock products that come from this area. Well, we try to relate this research with the potential of this different type of soil management to mitigate climate change. Climate change is one of the most important current environmental challenges. And silvopasture has shown in our area, at least, that is in France, also in the Mediterranean area, countries of Europe, that is one of the most powerful tools to both adapt the farming systems to climate change, and also to mitigate climate change. For this, we are focused on the evaluation of soil carbon, and the main reason for that is because soil, even in spite of that is not part of the accountability of the IPCC greenhouse gases balances, It is the section of the terrestrial ecosystems that have the largest amount of carbon. 85% of the carbon that is stored in terrestrial ecosystems is stored in the soil. But in this soil, the carbon is stored in different ways. It can be linked to macroaggregates, which are particles between 250 and 2,000 micrometers. And in there, the carbon is stored for a short term, years, months, decades, and microaggregates and smaller aggregate sizes between 53 and 250 micrometers and less than 53 micrometers, which means a long-term storage. The evaluation of the carbon resilience through the carbon association with the soil aggregate fractions in areas where precarbon burning and silvopasture is implemented is the main aim of this study. To evaluate, for this, we evaluate the effect of prescribed burning and silvopasture on different carbon fractions in the soil, the whole soil, and the different fractions that we mentioned before, in an experiment that was carried out in Galicia, northwest part of Spain, which has an Atlantic weather, with in an area with more or less 1,000 millimeters, but it's not evenly distributed, which causes a problem of forest fires. And we work on the framework of the Open to Preserve European Union project. Galicia is placed here. This is Spain, Portugal, and France. This is an overview of the area. What we did in the whole experiment was to make a prescribed burning on 20th February 2019. Once the vegetation was developed, we introduced grazing animals. In this case, we used the horse, the autochthonous breed of a horse, between 16th of September, 22 of October with horses, and in the year 2020, from the 17th of June to the 18th of June, and we mix it with until the 24th of July with cattle to better adapt the vegetation to the grazing behaviors of the animals. Here you have a layout of the treatments. You have the whole area was fired. Here we don't have we have a control, which is an area which is not fired. Here we implement no fire, no burning, no grazing, burning, no grazing, and burning, grazing. And here we have an example also with mechanical clearing. Well, we took soil samples up to 3 centimeters and from 3 to 10 centimeters at field, and we make the fractioning following the recommendations that were carried out developed by Elliott in 1986. Of course, for the statistical analysis, we use ANOVA and LSTT test. Well, as results, we can observe here the time evolution from the different treatments, which is before prescribed burning, after prescribed burning, after grazing in 2019, and after grazing in 2020. And here we see what is going on in the whole soil. We see that the before prescribed area burning in the 0 to 3 centimeters, the first centimeters, which are completely covered by the understory, which was around 0.5 meter tall. There is a strong amount of carbon undisturbed in total. But when we make an analysis, and this is also shown in macro aggregates and bigger microaggregates, macro and micro aggregates. But when we go to small particles, which are the particles that can have for a long-term carbon in the soil, we saw that after grazing, it has a recovery on soil carbon, higher storage, both when we analyze the 0 to 3 centimeters from under 3 to 10 centimeters. So silvopasture increases the carbon associated with the small soil fraction, which is a good thing, and this carbon is very stable and preserving the soil in the long term from this decades in even centuries. Here we present the different treatments that before prescribed burning. We see that there are not too much differences. Differences are more related with the soil depth being higher in the below part of the soil than in the top part of the soil due to the activity that is carried out by grazing mainly. We can see here that the 310 centimeters, the amount of carbon is higher than in the top part of the soil. Also because when we make most of these treatments have burning, and then you destroy the top layer, the vegetation that we have above. And here, after grazing, when we compare in 2019 the effect of the treatments, again we can see that the one that has better is the no burning, no grazing, but the burning and grazing has a highest one. So mechanical clearing decreases the carbon compared to the prescribed burning and silvopasture, which is the one that is here. And the main reason that we say that this is happening is because with the mechanical clearing, what you do is to cut the whole vegetation, and you don't have this effect of the animals with their urines and feces that increases the incorporation of the material and increase the dynamics of soil nutrients in the soil. Well, as a result, as a conclusion, we say that carbon associated with a small soil fraction increases after the grazing, being the carbon preserved in the soil in the long term. Therefore, in forest areas, silvopasture could be used as a climate change mitigation strategy at long term. And this was done thanks to a European Union project belonging to the called Interreg Sudoe, Junta de Galicia, and also within the framework of the USC, the University of Santiago de Compostela. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Rosa. We have plenty of time for questions. We haven't had any in the chat yet, but it's wide open.
I'm looking in the chat and the Q&A, and I don't currently see anything, but if
I have one question. So you said that the grazed areas were more likely, well, they increase the soil carbon more rapidly, perhaps because they're more dynamic. Do you think that over time they might even out, since the mechanical clearing, assuming that the biomass is being put on the ground, should also be incorporated into the soil eventually, unless it's being burned? But I was wondering if you could comment about that. Do you think long term they might be more similar?
In the long term, probably would be similar to the initial situation. In general, this is an example of experiment that in general we obtain when we introduce animals. The increase of dynamics increases soil carbon sequestration. And we have to think that, I mean, we have to think into things. First of all, if we are speaking about the O3 dip of the soil and 3 to 10, we have to see what is going on in the deeper soil layers. The main problem that we see when you don't have grazing or you don't make mechanical clearing is that the vegetation that falls down remains without being incorporated really in the soil due to the lack of sun, and even more we have acidic soils to the lack of bacteria that are able to incorporate that in the soil. So what is happening is that the mechanical clearing, at the end you have an increase on vegetation, but it's not incorporated in the soil. So the length of the deepness of the soil layer is smaller.
So what kind of mechanical treatments are they? Is it just mowing, or is it mastication, or?
It's the main mechanical treatment is mowing and mastication. Yeah.
And the biomass is just left there on the soil.
The biomass was left there in the soil. Yeah.
And those areas are being burned as well. The mechanically cleared area?
No, the one that was mechanical clearing was not burned before.
Okay. 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 If anyone new is just coming into the Ecosystem Services session, welcome. Our next speaker is going to be Cassady Dunson. She's a graduate student at the Stephen F. Austin State University, Arthur Temple College of Forestry and Agriculture. And she's going to talk to us about how prescribed fire in Eastern Texas influences soil water infiltration and other soil characteristics. Welcome, Cassady.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to not have my video going, and then I will come back at the end with the video. I think maybe. Can y'all see my screen and everything?
We can, it looks great. We can
Okay.
see both the screen and your video.
Okay. So the background, so, oh, okay. So there are numerous studies that have been conducted outside of the southeastern United States in mountainous regions and in coastal regions. Very few of these studies were conducted in Southwest forests on soil infiltration rates affecting being affected by prescribed burns. None of these studies were conducted in Texas, and I did my studies in East Texas. And none of these studies were had pre-burn data associated with them, but my study does have pre-burn associated data associated with it. Other studies didn't have, didn't do their pre-burn on the same site that they had their fire on. They did it on a comparable site. So my objectives during this study were to ascertain the effects that prescribed burning may have on soil water infiltration rates, if there was an influence of prescribed burning on soil water infiltration rates, and then quantify impacts of other select soil physical and chemical properties. But today we're only going to be talking about the soil water infiltration rates and some select soil physical properties. For my methodology, I took 3 different samples in the same locations. I took one before the prescribed burn took place. I took one 1 month after the prescribed burn took place and called this post-burn. And then I took another sample, my last sample, 3 months after the fire took place, and I called this green up. My study was conducted during the 2020 and 2021 burn seasons, and I had plots located on the United States Forest Service, the Davy Crockett and Angelina National Forests. And then I also had plots located on a private land, Simon Winston's Winstonate Land and Cattle tree farm. To establish my plots, the National Forest had pre-established plots that they were using for other things. So I based my plot center off of those pre-established plots. And then random plots were introduced for the Winston 8 plots. So from plot center, I would use a random number generator to determine direction and distance for my subplots where I would take my samples. And as you can see in the picture, I would take my samples and establish subplot 1. And then from subplot 1, I would do the same thing and establish subplot 2. And those are the 2 sampling locations that I would use for my study for each major plot. Moving into the field methods, I used soil unit confirmation using web soil survey developed by NRCS. They developed an app with UC Davis that goes on your phone, and you can use it out in the field. It gives you approximations about what type of soil you're potentially standing on. And then I field tested that with a soil auger to a depth of 1.5 meters to confirm what the soil survey app was saying. And then I started measuring the soil water infiltration using a double ring cylindrical infiltrometer. It was driven into the ground at 5 centimeters of depth. And then there's a mark on the inside of the infiltrometer in both rings. And I would fill it up with water to that 5 centimeter mark and start a timer. And then the measurements were taken at set time intervals from the top lip of the inner ring. And each plot was different time intervals. So one plot might be every minute, some plots were every 5 minutes, other plots I took a measurement every 10 minutes. It depended on how quickly the water was infiltrating down. I measured the infiltration rates until the rates leveled off, meaning that I got 3 infiltration rates of the same, so like 3 centimeters for every minute, 3 times in a row. Water is added to the inside ring first, and you want to take your measurements off the inside ring because the inside ring is going to be the most accurate because it's pushing water and it's only measuring the water that's going straight down and not what's infiltrating outwards. Oops. I also took soil bulk density samples using the excavation method to a 15 centimeter depth. And then I would take all the soil that I gathered from that hole and put it into a bag to be weighed in the lab. And then I would use cling wrap or plastic wrap to line the hole. And I would use a known water measurement to fill up the cling wrap in the hole to get the volume of water for the hole. I took 2 mineral soil samples. One bag was sent off to an external laboratory on campus for the chemical analysis. And then the other bag I used to determine soil texture, water stable aggregates, bulk density, particle density, and also pore space. I collected the organic matter in a 22 by 22 centimeter square, and these were randomly placed within a meter of the infiltrometer for each plot. I collected all the dead litter and the organic matter, or duff, as some people may know it as. And then for soil strength, I use a cone pentrometer with a 1.9 centimeter diameter cone, and I went to a depth of 15.2 centimeters. The infiltrometer measures in PSI, so I converted it to kilograms per centimeter squared. For the soil texture, I used the Boykus hydrometer method, and I took a hydrometer and a temperature reading at 40-second mark and the 2-hour mark. The 40-second reading was indicating the percentage of sand that had settled at the bottom. At the 2-hour reading indicates the amount of clay percentage that's left in solution. And then the 2 readings together will give you your silt, the percentage of silt. For bulk density, particle density, and pore space, the water content was determined from the sample as well. And then the soil was weighed wet, and then it was completely dried until a constant weight. And that's how I determined the bulk density, particle density. And then the soil was, after it had been dried, was added to a 1,000 millimeter graduated cylinder of water to measure the displacement. The water stable aggregates, I took 200 grams of field wet soil and I ran it through a sieve system with those 4 sizes, backwashed each sieve, and then filtered it through a coffee filter. And here are pictures of how I did that. So the left picture is the 5-gallon pail that I used, and I submerged the sieves in water, and then I would pour my soil on top of that and let it sit there for 5 minutes, and then I would take it out and let all the water drain out, and then put it back in and take it back out and I did that a total of 3 times. In the center picture is an upside down sieve, and that has been backwashed or is going to be backwashed through a large funnel and into a mason jar. And then on the right side, you can see the mason jar full of soil and is poured through the coffee filter inside the funnel, and then the excess water drips out. And then each coffee filter was labeled, and then it was weighed dry. For my statistics, I used a 2-factor design. An interaction of time and site was implemented with t-tests. A t-test was the broader view of the interpretations of interactions between the pre-burn to post-burn time interval, the post-burn to green up time interval, and the pre-burn to green up time interval. And then I used a one-way ANOVA to determine the interactions between the different burn regimes, which I had mentioned earlier. I had plots established on the National Forest and also on the Winston 8, which was privately owned. So the Winston 8s, they burn annually to biannually, so twice a year. And then the national forest is usually on a 3-year burning regime. My p-value for all of these was 0.1. Here you can see my soil conformation. The location, the NF indicates national forest, and the Winstonate is the Winstonate Land and Tree Farm. Along with all the plots, the soil series, and the soil texture that I determined in the lab. Some of these may be sandier than what you would normally find, but it could be because I did not take out any litter or anything from the sample whenever I ran the soil texture. So the important part for soil water infiltration, these are all of the plots and their different time intervals. And then the last column shows their average infiltration rates throughout the study. And the t-test, this is the comparison of the physical soil samples, physical soil properties between the 3 time frames. So you have the variable, and for soil strength, even though it measures all the way down to 15 centimeters, I had initially broken it down, and then I also included it as a whole group all added together. And the same for soil aggregates. That's the total soil aggregates. The change in mean to pre-burn to post-burn, those are the mean values. And then the asterisk beside them indicate that the p-value was significant at the p-value of 0.1. So the infiltration rate increased during all 3 time intervals, which was interesting. So, but it significantly increased from the pre-burn to the post-burn. And then it significantly increased from pre-burn to green up, so over the 3-month time period that I had measured it. This is the one-way ANOVA comparing the differences between the 2 different burn regimes during the different time frames or time intervals. NF also indicates the National Forest burn regime, and when W8 is the Winstonate burn regime. And so for infiltration rate, there was only a significant difference between the burn regimes at the green up time frame, or like 3 months post burn. So that was very interesting. And you can see that there's a large difference between the t-tests, which were significant between time frames, and the significance between the 2 different burn regimes, and that most of these are not significantly different between the 2 different burn regimes. So for my soil water infiltration rates, my study corresponded with some scientists who also described an increase in soil water infiltration rates. It contradicted with quite a few researchers who found that soil water infiltrates decreased after a disturbance or an intense fire, which they described mostly wildfires, and all of mine were prescribed burns. So there could be a difference there, that if they did prescribed burns during their research, that we could have had the same conclusions. It also contradicts other scientists who found infiltration rates increase and then decrease over time. And then it contradicts studies that say that there were no difference in infiltration rates after a fire. For my soil physical properties, the water stable aggregates may have been influenced by fire treatment and show a decrease in the soil's ability to decrease erosion and resist change. Bulk density was inconsistent, with some scientists who described decreases in bulk density, whereas mine increased. Other scientists describe differences in soil strength caused by many different variables: organic matter, intensity of the fire, and repetitive burning. The latter may be the driver of this study, repetitive prescribed burns. And O-horizon depths showed significant differences during all three timeframes, with initial significant decrease, which is generally expected directly after a prescribed burn. Concluding, prescribed burns positively impacted soil water infiltration rates on these East Texas soils. Over the short time frame, it did increase soil water infiltration rates by 53.68% from pre-burn to green up timeframes. These results may be short-term responses from repetitive burning treatments on resilient soils in East Texas. The soil strength initially was weaker or less compacted, but increased towards the end of the study. The aggregates increased significantly over all timeframes, and the O-horizon density did not follow trends normally associated. I would like to acknowledge my committee members for my thesis, Dr. Oswald, Dr. Farish, and Mr. Tyson Hart, my field and lab help, and of course, the United States Forest Service for letting me use their forests and their pre-established plots. And special thanks to Paul Wood of Simon Winston's Winston 8 Land and Tree Farm for getting all of our prescribed burns done. Any questions?
Okay, thanks very much, Cassady. Really nice talk. We haven't had any questions in our in Hoover yet, but I do encourage and invite. Oh, I see one here. Said if you okay, just asking if you have questions. But in the meantime, in case people are kind of formulating their questions or want to put them on the chat or questions and answer session, I was wondering, when you did the infiltration rate measurements, did you make any changes to the surface litter, or was the surface litter removed and was it placed right on the mineral soil?
I left it as I found it in the field. So the only thing I really moved were pine cones or like large sticks, because the infiltrometer wouldn't get a good seal into the ground, but I left all the other litter and everything else.
I'm still trying to get an idea of what might be the mechanism of increasing the infiltration rates. Do you think it might mostly be because of the removal of that litter and the duff that was right on the surface that might be acting as kind of a hydrophobic layer?
It could be.
I've noticed I've done similar infiltration experiments in the past, and I found that duff right on the surface is really it's kind of oily and kind of water resistant. Slow things down. That's interesting.
I mean, it looks like Chris is also asking a question: were the hydrophobic compounds a part of these soils following fire?
I did not measure hydrophobic compounds of the soil, so I would not know the answer to that.
Thanks for that, Cassady. Just to let you know that Dr. Farish was actually a professor of mine over 30 years ago at Louisiana Tech, and I worked in his lab. So it's good to see that happening.
That's awesome.
It's good to see work being done in East Texas too. It's been kind of a long neglected part of the longleaf pine ecosystem distribution and just in general.
Yes.
Glad you're doing this work, soils work especially. I think, like one possible difference with with those other studies, those wildfire studies, is that there's so much heat that there might be concretion of the soils, that the organic matter actually gets volatilized and then recoagulates in a way that cements everything together and causes those hydrophobic layers, which thank goodness don't seem to happen with our kind of nice mild prescribed fires in the southeast.
Yes.
Well, thanks again, Cassady. And we're going to transition to the next talk. Chris, whenever you want to upload your presentation, that'd be great. And we'll hit it right at 1:40 here in a minute. In the meantime, yeah, I guess I'll give you another minute.
There you go. That looks great, Chris.
Awesome.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and introduce you, Chris. Their next talk is going to be by Christopher Dicus. He's a professor at California Polytechnic State University. And he's going to be talking to us today about the effects of fuel treatments on greenhouse gas emissions in California. And I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, this is going to be talking about some introductory sorts of data analysis coming through, and you'll get to hear me belly aching a lot about the methodology, and you'll see here in a little bit why. I'm all excited too about some of our co-authors that are here. All of these are students at Cal Poly. It's interesting, I actually hired a legion, almost 25 students to work on this project. And because of COVID, where everything was virtual, I did not meet with any of these students in person, which made it exceedingly challenging. And so just let you know, this project is funded by Cal Fire, and they're wanting to look at, how are after you do some sort of fuel treatment, how is that going to impact the potential carbon on the site, for greenhouse gas emissions, both in terms of, taking materials off the site, as well as any potential emissions that might happen. So we can see something like this. This is a photo I took on the Klamath Mountains where they had a thin followed by a prescribed burn. It's like, okay, great. We can definitely see this looks like a much more fire resilient landscape. But what does that do in terms of carbon? Because that's something that's very important to everyone, and especially to our funders, Cal Fire. So sort of the background of this is that Cal Fire and California in general are releasing enormous funds for fuel treatments across the state. We're talking literally tens of millions of dollars per year going into fuel treatments across the state. And this is mostly funded by greenhouse gas funds that are generated with carbon credits and these other sorts of things. So lots and lots and lots of money going into fuel treatments. In fact, I've kind of joked around that, well, heck, we can just use that money and we can just smother any potential fire that could come out because there's so much going out. So they've got this application process by which, you have to get these funds to do these fuel treatments on a site. And most of these applicants, they're like a business manager for a fire safe council, which is like an NGO in California that works at fire safety, or it could be a captain in a fire station that's out there. And so these are the types of people that are providing, these applications. And each one of these applications to get this, get a piece of this very enormous pie, there's some certain things that they have to provide, including like you're supposed to provide GIS polygons, you have a narrative with the scope of work and maps and everything. But because this is all being funded via greenhouse gas funds in California, the applicants must account for the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, unfortunately, there is no seamless methodology, and you're going to see here in a little bit, it's just going to kind of blow your mind on how this is done. And it's not for the weak of heart. And I can say that looking through the 150 or so applications for which, we were tasked to do two things, kind of provide a third-party audit of the applications, and then try to provide, ways how can we improve the system for Cal Fire, this process and in this methodology. So it wasn't surprising that the vast majority of the people that did here just did an absolutely terrible job. And I'm not trying to dog them, because we'll see here in just a second, it is a incredibly difficult, arduous, maddening process in which to get the information that's needed by California law in order to have these funds continue on. Now, this seems like this is the basic calculator, and there's different calculators depending upon the program for which the applicant has applied. But it looks pretty easy, right? It's like, okay, I've got some things up here, all right, how big is our treatment boundary, land ownership type? Okay, that's cool. I mean, it doesn't look so bad. We fill out some of these things, just put some numbers in here, and all of a sudden it's going to kick out some numbers over here, which is what Cal Fire is eventually trying to get at. Well, for those that are in the United States, you might be familiar, especially like if you're into football, there's a sportscaster there that's always like, not so fast, my friend. And so just kind of come out that this calculator is not easy to come through. And all of these nice little simple little, inputs that you have here, there's a lot of work to get that information. So for example, something that's very, very important is like the forest practice site class. And this is important because it kind of helps as you're growing trees in this methodology, you know, how things fast are going to grow. And so none of the applicants provided this information as far as the forest practice site class. And this includes everything from the incredibly fast growing redwoods on the north coast of, you know, the Sierra Nevada mountains, or then you've got sort of the oak woodlands that might occur more in Southern California. But again, the applicants for these are mainly firefighters or business managers. And these are things that are only provided generally by foresters. And these are not timber harvest. And for those, the THP, that's a timber harvest permit. You have to provide that in a timber harvest permit, but none of these projects were part of a timber harvesting because it's fuels. They're taking out smaller materials and not the sort of the commercial thing. So that's difficult. You know, you come up there, well, what's the annual probability of fire occurrence? Well, I don't know, you know, if we're in Southern California, it's Tuesday, I guess it's time for a massive wildfire, you know, sort of thing. So we had to go into a website was actually created by Cal Fire scientists, which I was very excited to see, but we'll see that that is not so easy. And then the sort of thing that kind of comes up, the real meat of this whole process is this right here. It's like, oh, cool. We just have to put in like 5 different inputs into the spreadsheet and yay, we're done. We can go about our business. Now, you know, California is very diverse. You know, we've got everything from redwood forest up to, you know, alpine mountains to chaparral shrublands to the desert. And so, you know, there's fuel treatments going on all over the state, but this methodology is only for forests. And the stuff that we're having to work through here, the data that we need comes through the forest vegetation simulator, in which we all, you know, if you've ever used this, you know that this is only works if you've got stand level forest data. Well, again, because you've got people that are working in fire stations, a captain that's doing this, I mean, they don't have this data. And, you know, if they said they did, it's like, I wouldn't, you know, quite trust them because it's just not what they do. So let's go through this process just a little bit, just to kind of explain how difficult this is. And I see Shaming Wang is on here from Sonoma Technology. He's going to feel my pain because his consulting firm that he works at is doing sort of a similar parallel project. And so we'll commiserate and perhaps have a beer afterwards. All right, so fire probability. It's like, yay, Cal Fire, they set up this amazing site where we can go in, you know, and this is great. Okay, well, interesting. You know, again, the applicants, most of them didn't provide very good polygons at all. And if they did, that wasn't within the projection that was needed within the website. So in many cases, most cases, we had to recreate the polygons in order to get into this site. And then once you do this, you come through and, you know, thank goodness for Cal Fire, they've got this algorithm which they derive that you can see here on the left-hand side. They can look at what is, you know, the potential fire probability across a given landscape. And so, but even though this is difficult, we see like up here on the right-hand side, very low probability in this particular landscape, but very high probability over here in another part of the landscape. And so just the way things work, we ended up taking the mean of the entire project area in order to make this happen. And it didn't really get at the extremes of one side or the other, either tail of that curve. So that's potential things like, yeah, I don't feel great about this, but this is the best information we got. And thank goodness Cal Fire scientists provided the sort of website that we could go into. Now then, getting the stand data. Now, again, this is crazy difficult in order to get, and not a single one of the applicants for which we analyzed actually provided the stand data. And so this would be an example of a potential fuel reduction site. And you can see the project area consists of different sorts of fuel treatments. We had roadside clearance, we had shaded fuel breaks, we had other sorts of things going on in here. And again, most of the applicants, which we had to do, they didn't provide this, or if they did, they were kind of wrong. So we had to go through and recreate all the polygons based upon the narrative that they provided and perhaps some maps that we saw here. Now, again, no one provided this stand data because no one were foresters, you know, professional foresters that were doing this. Again, most of the applicants that are doing this, you know, fire captains at a fire station, you know, NGOs, et cetera. So there was a system, you know, been working with a lot of very, very smart people. You know, this is sort of the process by which we got that actual stand data, which would be great if it would just been able to be provided that we could then put into the analysis to put into those 4 little awesome little input windows into the calculator. So the stand data, because nothing was provided, we had to get that via remote sensing. And we use what we refer to as LEMA data, which is the Landscape Ecology Modeling, Mapping, and Analysis page that looks at the West Coast, has sort of a almost a forest inventory across it. You know, they're using remote sensing to kind of come up with species and size classes and everything. So again, this is not actually boots on the ground that we're using, you know, information, but instead we're using remote sensing data. Now, after you go and get the data that's out there, it is a tremendous, tremendous effort. And you have to be an absolute GIS guru, because once you get the data, you've got to clip it to a treatment. And there's just intermediate step after intermediate step after intermediate step. And if you don't even if you get one of them wrong, it's going to be a real issue that's out there. And then finally, when that's all done, yay, we're going to export it out to an Excel spreadsheet. Whew, boy, I'm so glad that we did that. Now, after you do that, it's like, dang, damn it, there's more. We got to do more. So, you know, one of the things that develop is trying to get this data that was an Excel spreadsheet so that it would be able to feed into the forest vegetation simulator in order to get out the data that we needed to run this the CAL FIRE calculator. Is that our friends over at Sonoma Technology created this R code, in which was able to convert the data. But so we had, all right, well, we got to learn R. Great. So we're learning R. Then it goes into an Access database that you've got to do. Okay, great. Most of us had never used an Access database, so we've got to go there. So once we finally got all this data that was finally in the right way, we then had to take it through the Forest Vegetation Simulator, FVS. And so sort of the 4 treatments that we looked at there is like, okay, what if you did nothing, sort of a baseline treatment and no fire? All right, well, great. You know, that's one issue we have with carbon. Well, what if you didn't do anything, but then had a wildfire? Okay, well, that's the other scenario. The other 2 scenarios is like, okay, let's treat these areas per what the applicant said in their application to get this funding. And it's like, after you treat it, we're going to have no fire. If no fire happens, yay, we're all happy. But if a wildfire does come through, what impact is that going to have on carbon? So again, this is going to be sort of preliminary data that we see up through here. But this is sort of preliminary results. And, you know, again, there's so much noise that's in this because, you know, we're looking at everything from the redwoods to the mixed conifer forest of the Sierra Nevada mountains to some of like oak woodlands on the central coast. And so it's just a lot of noise. And so by just doing a single ANOVA, just kind of running it, there was not any significant difference between there. It's like, well, let's take it, you know, perhaps not the best stats, but let's kind of come through and let's just kind of compare specific sorts of things. We see there's no statistical difference between all of these 4 different sorts of runs. Well, how do they compare like on an individual basis? Is there something that's better than the other? And so again, very preliminary. I recognize this. We're going to tease out a whole bunch of things. So we did look, you know, when I started doing just some basic t-tests between the different treatment types, just like comparing untreated, you know, versus no fire versus a fire, some things did start to kind of come out. So if you look on the left-hand side, the last 2 things we see here are, you know, you've got, you know, there's baseline, this is non-treated. And if you don't have a fire, hey, this is sort of the carbon that we're expecting to see after the end of the project term. But if you do have a fire, we do have a significant reduction. And that should make sense. The more stuff that you have, things are going to burn up. We didn't see anything, though. It's kind of surprising a little bit. If you treated these areas, you did not see a difference at all between fire and no fire. All right. So another significant thing that we saw, again, just basic t-test, looking at, well, what if we didn't have a fire at all? And so we looked at it and we saw that without a fire, there was a significant reduction, which kind of makes sense if there's no fire, that if you're taking materials off the site, you are going to see a reduction in carbon on the site. But again, if you had a fire through there, even though, just kind of eyeballing it, you can look at here's fire baseline versus treated, the carbon, it looks like there's more, but it's like statistically it didn't come out again because of all the noise. And I recognize this, and we're going to try to tease this out looking at the specific regions of the area which looking. So we recognize that, this is just for within the treatment area itself. And so we recognize, though, that fuel treatments have a greater impact that's beyond just what's in the actual treatment itself. Because if the fire moves into a treated area, the assumption is it's at least going to slow down and it's going to have a less of impact to the area that's passed there. And so there is another part of this process called the impact boundary analysis. And you can sort of see, here's a treated area that's sort of along a roadside. Well, we have a larger impact area that this treatment could potentially impact that could affect vegetation outside of the actual treatment area. And so that's what we're looking at now. We're kind of coming up with an assumption that, it's just, again, what is this impact boundary? What should it look like? We had sort of a methodology that's been sort of standardized. I was talking with my friends at the spatial informatics group last night, and there might be a better way that we might look if we do an iteration. But at present, all we did was just take what was the biggest different, what was the biggest width? We'll just double that, and that's the sort of the methodology. But once we created this greater impact boundary analysis, then we had to go into a whole nother sort of software package looking at the interagency fuel treatment decision support system. That's a mouthful. So we used, we typically just say IFTDIS, which is, I know, sounds goofy, but that's where we're rolling. So our very, very early conclusions, recognizing that there's a lot of analysis to continue going on, is that within the treatment itself, not looking at the larger picture, but just within the treatment area, that there was reduced carbon if the area was treated and then you had a wildfire. Well, that would sort of make sense. You have a wildfire come through and it's going to burn up a lot of these really dense stand. We also saw that there were significant differences in carbon if you treated, but there was no fire. Well, that kind of makes sense too, intuitively, because you've got, you're taking materials out, you're, relocating that carbon that was on site. Now, right now, we're seeing that if you have a fire, there's really no difference whether it's treated or not. And, that just like, I don't know, there's a lot of assumptions within this methodology. And so my expectation is that we will expect differences once we look at this larger impact area analysis. Otherwise, what's the point of doing these fuel treatments? And we can see, just like on this photo right here on the left-hand side, we're pretty sure if a fire came through here, it's going to have less severity, less intensity. It's going to have so you're going to perhaps have more carbon left on versus the right-hand side over here, where it's just going to be total consumption.
You're at 2 minutes left, Chris.
All right. Well, this is my last slide, so this is great. Again, the big conclusion we got out there is that there was significant complexity with this. I mean, it's maddening. When they approached me about doing this, like, yeah, I can run FBS, I can do, fire behavior simulation, not knowing the extensive nature of going through this and trying to run a lab of 25 people, undergraduate students, to try to make this happen, having to know ArcGIS, Excel, R, XS, FBS, IFTDIS. And so another thing that came out of there, again, is like, with this complexity, the applications that we reviewed were very vague and they're very wrong. And so finally, this is my great plea to the people that's out here, is that this methodology is only for forests, and shrublands and grasslands. They are the redheaded stepchildren of the plant world, and we need more carbon accounting in this, and we could use this. We need it. If you're working on it, God bless you, because it is desperately needed in our field, and hopefully someone's working on that. And with that, I'm finished up.
All right, thanks, Chris. That's great. We do have one question, and I think enough time for it. We had a question from Joanna Nelson. She said, hey, Chris, you've got these 4 scenarios for Forest Veg Simulator. Is there a way to add another simulation for treated with prescribed fire, which you would think would be carbon loss, but probably less than for wildfire?
And I'll chime in. This is Joanna. I added an extra comment that when I see a result of no significant difference between treated with wildfire or treated without, treated and prescribed wildfire wouldn't show up. But that's an action I'm interested in.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to teasing it out. To your question, Joanna, we did not look at prescribed fire unless it was part of the application. That was their fuel treatment, which, some of them were. We had to, so you had your basic, mastication, thinning, prescribed fire. These were all things we looked at. But we only, to this point, just looked at what the applicants said that they were going to do.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks again, Chris. We're going to need to move on to our next presentation. And our next presentation will be by Sam Flake, who's a postdoctoral associate at North Carolina State University in the Dynamic Ecosystems and Landscapes Laboratory. And he's going to be talking about predicting the economic cost and benefits of fuels treatments in the Sierra Nevada and their potential benefits to ecosystem services. So as soon as he gets his presentation up, I'll hand it over to you, Sam.
Well, thanks. Let me just get this going. All right, that should be working, right?
Looks
Yeah,
good.
looks great.
Cool, great. Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm gonna be talking about a sort of different angle on a similar problem as Chris was, which is trying to understand what the long-term consequences are of different management activities. This is part of a big collaborative project led by Matt Sloggy and Pat Manley at the Forest Service, and based on past work by Charles Maxwell and Rob Scheller and other folks in Rob's lab, and Kristen Wilson at TNC on a past version of this project. So the general problem here is probably familiar to people. In Western forests, specifically in the central Sierra Nevada of California, we've seen big changes in both climate and in forest structure due to past and present forest management and fire exclusion. Geez, I'm sorry. Oh, that's the fun. I don't know how to mute. I think I hung it up. All right, sorry about that. There's other associated problems and drivers of fire, an increase in severe fire weather and drought, as well as drought-associated outbreaks of bark beetles. And the effects of those on ecosystem services are sort of unpredictable, and how management can shape that response is also difficult to understand, or poorly known at the moment. Putting it another way, historically, a lot of these drier forests were maintained in an open condition, particularly by cultural burning by people indigenous to the area. But our present stands are in a much different condition. Buildup of fuels and climate change have led to these catastrophic wildfires that torch, huge areas and threaten lives and livelihood of towns. And so we have some choices of the trajectory that we want to try to push these forests. If we can try and restore low intensity fire regime and maintain an open stand condition that prevents catastrophic wildfire, that'll probably be desirable. Or the current trajectory we're on, these stands will find some equilibrium some way or another, whether that is through our management decisions or the wildfires that we're seeing these days. And so this will have a big effect on ecosystem services. And ecosystem services provide us a good mechanism for comparing among different trajectories and evaluating different management strategies. Some of the services are carbon storage, which has been discussed today, Also harvesting, whether that's saw timber or harvested biomass for fuel. Different values that we might try to maintain in our stands, like old growth forests or biodiverse forests, and reducing these extreme severe fires that threaten the wildland urban interface. So these are things that we're looking at as our part of this collaborative project. Our collaborators are looking at a broader range of ecosystem services like water quantity and quality, which is especially important in the Lake Tahoe Basin, wood products and economic aspects of all this. And of course, there are other important services that we might try to implement in the future, like cultural values, which are especially important for Indigenous people in the area who might have cultural reasons to use fire for basket making or wild foods. Recreation is very important in the Lake Tahoe area, habitat for rare species, numerous other services that we might try to implement into this framework. And so we need active management to try and prevent the loss of these ecosystem services due to extreme wildfire, but funding is limited, though perhaps there's more funding now that needs to be allocated. And it's hard to fund these sorts of treatments for a lot of reasons. Fire is unpredictable and stochastic, and it's not immediately clear that you needed to treat this stand 5 years ago until it is obvious. Compared with the cost of suppression, which is the benefit is immediate when a fire is burning toward your town. The benefits of doing these treatments are externalized. They're way down the road potentially, and they're uncertain. So it's harder to quantify the dollar value of doing these treatments. And different landowners might also value the treatments differently or have different incentives. And so a structure to try and bring all this together is the structure called a forest resilience bond. This is a conservation finance structure, which allows current funding to be invested in restoration activities and then recoup some of that money from projected ecosystem services. And so it's essentially a bond that provides seed money for doing restoration activities for fuel treatments or prescribed fire. It also provides a structure for partnership among different funders, whether private or public funders, land managers, and beneficiaries, which might be towns or utilities or private landowners, other people who would benefit from these restoration activities. The challenge of implementing this kind of structure is that we need to be able to forecast what ecosystem services will look like in the future as a result of our management decisions. And that's a real challenge because of all the uncertainties that have been discussed today and that are apparent when you try to look at a whole landscape and how to manage it. So this study, we're trying to assess the impact of management on ecosystem services across this giant landscape over 2.5 million acres. And it's a good landscape for doing this sort of work because it's been well researched and there's a lot of interest in active management in the area. Each one of these polygons represents some different research project or management initiative, including a pilot forest resilience bond in the Yuba watershed, which it's a smaller project. It's a partnership between Tahoe National Forest and a private company called Blue Forest. And it's already resulted in substantial area under prescribed burn and also mechanical thinning from below, other fuel treatments. So taking this pilot and trying to see, is it feasible to scale this up to this giant area in the Central Sierra? So the tool we use to try and answer these questions, what will be the impact of our management choices on ecosystem services, is Landis 2 dynamic landscape model, which I think you'll hear more about in the next talk also. And we use the Scrapple fire extension, which is really flexible and allows us to implement a whole range of different scenarios. So we can assess modified ignitions, different fire weather, different climate change scenarios or historical climate, the fuels that are present, different disturbances. So the legacy of past fires or bark beetle infestation outbreaks. And we can also evaluate different management scenarios in this context to try and understand what the trajectories and variability might be. The scenarios we're interested in run a full gamut. I'm showing a subset here from really minimal kind of treatment, which is only harvesting on private industrial and non-industrial forests, and also fuel treatments within the defense zone, which is just right around settlements in the WUI. A moderate management regime, which includes more extensive fuel treatments, even in more remote forests, hand thinning out there. And then a maximal management scenario, which implements prescribed fire and harvesting to try and replicate the historic fire return interval. And so in our model, we see some pretty large effects of climate change on fire weather and fire behavior. So in green here, and this will be true for the rest of the talk, green we have our historical climate, and orange we have an RCP 8.5 climate scenario. And we see in this top figure that fire weather index on average is higher than an average year in the RCP 8.5 scenario. And also it has some spikes to really high fire weather index, which are higher than anything we've seen in the record so far. And it results in some years having just massive amounts of area burned. This particular year is close to 10% of the whole landscape burning in 1 year. So without management, it seems like under this model, there could be really catastrophic fire in the future in this area. When we implement these different management scenarios, we see one, the effect of climate change, and two, also the effect of management. So there's a couple comparisons we can make here. On the top left, we're showing all of the fires that burned through this area in a 40-year model run. This is just a subset of the area too, to show some detail. We have Lake Tahoe here in the bottom right, going down toward the Central Valley to the west here. And we see under the future climate scenario, much more fire than under the historical climate scenario. These are simulated fires, not historical fires. Under the moderate management scenario, we can see all this purple is prescribed fire that's been implemented at some point over this 40-year period that we simulated. And it appears that there might be some effect on reducing wildfire, especially in this future climate scenario, where if we compare this bottom left to this bottom right, we see much less high intensity fire. Of course, this is all stochastic and super variable, so we need to do more model runs to look at the variability in these patterns, but it seems promising as an avenue for exploring that. Of course, there's potential trade-offs to all of this management. Chris just talked about some of them, having to estimate carbon and smoke, things like that. And so in our model structure, carbon comes out of the model, so it's easy to compare between different scenarios. So here, there's a lot going on in this figure. We have above ground biomass on the y-axis. These are in units of grams per meter squared. Just divide them by 100 and you'll get tons per hectare. So sort of intermediate here up to a pretty densely stocked stand at the top. This is over a 40-year model run for 6 different scenarios. In orange, we have our CP 8.5 scenario, and in green, we have our historical climate. And we're comparing between the minimal, moderate, and maximal fire regimes. So the big pattern here is that under RCP 8.5, we're likely to see less above ground carbon across the whole landscape on average. And that our management scenarios seem to have a large effect on carbon also, so or biomass. So our minimal regime, biomass just continues to accumulate for a while until it starts to burn off. And our moderate regime shows a pretty large decrease in biomass due to thinning primarily. And our maximal regime, which represents a restoration of the historic fire return interval, shows a pretty sharp decrease in biomass as it all gets burned off and thinned. But it sort of flattens out here, maybe representing what the natural carbon carrying capacity should be on this landscape. And showing that we can reach that pretty quickly if we are, well, it's a pretty crazy amount of burning, but if we're able to do that, we might be able to reach this target and have a more resilient carbon stocks. It might not be optimal under climate change to lose all this carbon that fast. So these are trade-offs that we have to think about. Climate change might have weird interactions with the treatments and with fire behavior. So in this top panel, we see the change, predicted change over 40 years of white fir biomass, where yellow and orange are decreases in biomass. Here's our minimal management scenario under RCP 8.5 versus the maximal management scenario under RCP 8.5. And we see already a big decrease in white fir biomass under this minimal management strategy. Of course, there's a much greater decline in the maximal strategy, which is trying to clear out all these ladder fuels, all these small white firs. But it seems like we might get a help from bark beetles potentially in the future. So accounting for these interactions and how these different processes interact with management will be one of the big challenges of trying to project ecosystem services into the future. So some of the take-home messages from these initial results are, it seems like management may be able to have pretty big impacts on reducing undesired impacts of climate change. But the particulars of it are difficult to predict. And so we need to assess how these different services trade off. Fire is resiliency to fire versus carbon versus other versus hydrology, other processes we're interested in. And it also shows that, to reach these really resilient stands, we need really to do a lot of management. And so having these projections to help to fund fuel treatments might more align our funding mechanisms with the pace and scale of the challenges that our forests face. Our next steps are to take these forecasts and once they're finalized, send them out to all our partners, all our collaborators, who are going to work on other aspects of ecosystem services that are important in the region: hydrology, wood harvesting, wood products, carbon pricing for trying to recoup some costs of treatment from carbon markets, and decision support tools and trying to optimize management strategies. And yeah, with that, I would like to take any questions, and I'll leave you with this nice picture of a Jeffrey pine on the shore of Lake Tahoe.
All right, thanks, Sam. It's a great presentation. Do not have any questions yet in the Q&A and chat, but I encourage you to not be shy. Let's see. We have one in our Zoom chat. It says, have your team thought about how and if you'll potentially move towards a newer IPCC's climate assessment projections?
We have considered that. Yeah, so right now we're still using the older versions, which are more available. I think once the data is available in a downscaled format, we'll be able to switch over pretty quickly. But yeah, so right now we're relying on downscaling tools provided by other people. So there's a little bit of a time lag there.
I had one question for the first map that you showed of the distribution of your projections. It seems like in the lower panel, when you went from the further back, sorry. Keep going.
Further, is it in the results or?
Yeah, I guess it was in the results. I must have passed it somehow. Where you show the 4 different panels. Yeah, maybe that one. I'm sorry. So on the bottom panel under future climate minimal management and then future climate moderate management, it seems like that cluster in the southwestern corner there of moderate to high severity kind of disappears. Right. But it's not being replaced by low severity prescribed fire. So I was wondering what's going on there.
I think that might be, I wish I'd pulled up maps of the other harvests, but that might be an effect of mechanical and hand thinning. Because that's as part of the wildland urban interface where prescribed fire might not have been as actively used in our scenarios. Okay. Or it might just be the fires didn't burn there. for whatever reason, though it is a hotspot in every other treatment, in every other panel. But I'll have a better answer once I run some replicates and look at the probability of that area burning.
You know, the model's these sophisticated, it's hard to know what all is going on in there, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of moving parts.
And stochasticity.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks again, Sam. It's almost time for our next presentation. So I guess we'll get ready to transition to our next speaker. Introduce Gaby Ayres, who's going to be the last speaker for our ecosystem services session here. She's a PhD candidate at Northern Arizona University, and she's going to bring us into the indigenous lands of Southern Rockies of New Mexico to talk about modeling forest change and effects of management under climate change scenarios. So I'll turn it over to you, Gaby.
Great. Are you all seeing my screen fine?
You look good.
Okay, happy days. All right, good day, everyone. My name is Gaby Ayres. I'm an international PhD candidate at NAU in the School of Forestry. For those of you trying to pinpoint my accent to a nationality, I am originally from South Africa, and I came to the US to do my PhD a couple years back. So like many PhDs, there are a number of moving parts to one's research project, gears, if you have it. And broadly, my research is looking at forest response to climate change in the Western United States through the use of a forest landscape model called Landis 2. And so today, I'm really going to be talking about one of the gears needed in our approach to move forward with this research. Before I begin, full disclosure, and like our previous presenter, who seems much further down the road, I still consider myself a novice Landis user. Saying that, I'm using it every day and learning every day, with the hope that I'll soon move into 6th gear and be on the road to being a better Landis user. So let's talk Landis. In today's day and age, we really find ourselves immersed in this realm of computational power, technology, big data. And this is really exciting for scientists because it's equipped us with all these really awesome tools and access to vast amount of information that otherwise was generally not available. And so in recent years, we've seen this development of computational models, Landis 2 being one of them. So there's still definitely need for empirical studies, given, you know, these are the studies that provide us the fundamental understanding for processes that are implemented and incorporated into these models. But there are some constraints, and those constraints lie really in integrating finer resolution processes like photosynthesis and growth functions at larger scales, and particularly in spatially explicit frameworks. And so into Landis 2. Like I said, it's a forest landscape model. It was developed and optimized for these large scale spatial interactions to simulate forest dynamics under the various climates, disturbances, and management strategies. And so it kind of has two parts. You've got the core model, and then the core model is coupled with a series of extensions that are selected by its user. And there are a number of extensions to be used, many of which I'm not familiar with just because we're not using them or they're not necessarily useful for our research, but I'm putting them up there to show you kind of the capabilities of this tool and advocate its use for addressing kind of complex landscape scale questions. It's certainly gained traction as a tool for answering these questions. The last I made a note of, there was over 1,200 users, which I'm sure has increased significantly since then. And you can see that it's heavily used in the United States, which is where it was developed, but it's been adopted on 5 of 7 continents. So perhaps following my PhD, I can look into its use on my home soils and make that 6. So let's dive a little bit more into the model. Here we're looking at a bit of a conceptual framework for it to illustrate interactions between forest structure and disturbances under various climate projections. Climate affects forest composition and structure through influencing the biophysical environment. And that obviously affects establishment and growth of various tree species, which also affects and also affects specific disturbances, which are entirely dynamic with regimes. So Landers can produce a number of outputs, many of which are representative for ecosystem services, and this is why we like it. To briefly touch on fire, given we are at a fire conference, fire disturbance is driven by combination of climate and fuels. We have selected the dynamic fuels and fire extension. The dynamic fire system simulates ignition, initiation, spread, and damage. The spread rates use equations from the Canadian Forest Fire Behavior Prediction System, and they're dependent on fuel type, weather, and topography. And this extension must be used in conjunction with a fuel extension. And so the dynamic fuels extension uses the cohort species and age ranges to determine fuel type for each cell on a landscape. And so we went with this fire extension simply because we're dealing with a pretty complex landscape. It's really interesting. It's got a mix of species and quite a diverse topography, which you will see in some coming photos. So before showing you some photos, I just wanted to talk about the succession extension that we've selected. We're using PNET, and this is essentially photosynthesis and evapotranspiration as a lumped parameter model for carbon and water balance. And it's based on two principal relationships. The first is the maximum photosynthetic rate as a function of foliar nitrogen, foliar nitrogen concentrations. And then stomatal conductance is a function of this realized photosynthetic rate. And so with PNET, the landscape gets initialized with species age cohort groups, and the cohort biomass is assumed to be homogeneously distributed in each cell. And so, that means that shade conditions are homogeneous within the cell as well. Higher biomass cohorts are therefore, given priority to light and shade in the model. We decided to use PNET extension simply because at the time of making that decision, we're working in the West, and the West experiences and is expected to experience, very dry climate conditions. And with PNET's ability to simulate species survival based on that dynamic competition, we thought it would be the best extension to go with. However, saying that, there are other popular extensions, NECN being one of them. And I must make a note that these are constantly being developed and improved to account for things more and more. So yeah, so a bit about, there we go. A bit about our umbrella project, or rather my umbrella project for my dissertation. We are working on 3 landscapes in Western United States. And we have a northern site up in Wyoming, a central site in Colorado, and then our most southern site in New Mexico, which is the landscape I'm kind of speaking about today. But really, these forests are very important to us in the sense that they provide us these critical ecosystem services. And under, future projections of climate and disturbances, these are at risk. And so we're hoping that regionally scaled adaptive forest management strategies can reduce forest change and support adaptations in our species. So in a nutshell, we're hoping to, contribute to the resilience of these forests so that we're not at a loss come the next century. And we're working with various stakeholders. We've got the 3 national forests, and then we're also working with the Mescalero Apache tribal land down in southern New Mexico. So here is the Sacramento Mountain landscape. It has, 2 ranger districts for the national forest, a northern one called Smoky Bear, and then a southern one called the Sacramento, and it's separated by the Mescalero Reservation. In total, it covers about 4,500 square meters, and it ranges in elevation from about 1,200 to call it 3,700 meters. It has cool winters, hot summers, and a summer monsoon where most of the precipitation falls, and frequent lightning strikes, which is obviously important when it comes to the fire regime. And so I just want to bring your attention to this figure that some of my colleagues published. And they carried out some dendrochronological work to reconstruct historical and recent fire regimes in the Mescalero. And then they compared it to existing published fire regime data of the adjacent Lincoln National Forest. And so the continuous black line represents the study sample depth for the Mescalero, with the dotted one being for the Lincoln National Forest. The red line is your PDSI values, with negative values showing drier than normal conditions and positive values higher than normal conditions. But what I really, the purpose of showing you this image was to kind of highlight this shaded gray region, which is to show, the gap in fire that the landscape experienced. And that's really important for us because essentially the landscape is a sitting matchbox. There's been fire suppression on the landscape that has led to a lot of fuel buildup probably, and under projected climate conditions, we just don't know what's going to happen on this landscape. And especially with drought and increased temperatures, fire might possibly cause, a shift in forest conversion. So some pictures from our study site. This is kind of the lower elevations. You find grasslands and poor soil conditions. They're dominated by blue grama and associated species in semi-arid desert brush. And this sort of, as you start to get higher, transitions into pinyon juniper woodlands. And we see, junipers, pinyon pine, and some gamble oak. As we move a little higher, and we increase in elevation, sort of between 1,300 and 2,100 meters, we start to see more ponderosa forest. On the lower end, ponderosa stands are surrounded by woodland species, so some junipers and pinyon. Above 2,000 meters, we see almost pure ponderosa pine stands, but they are frequently accompanied by gamble oak. And then at our highest elevations, on the highest and coolest slopes, which are typically north facing, they're dominated by Douglas fir, followed by southwestern white pine and white fir. Doug fir is a very prominent species on this landscape, and you also find it, frequently in the lower elevation valleys. Aspen, you'll find kind of in pockets where, they've replaced wildfire areas, but we also found them in sort of these high elevation meadow regions, and the drainages leading to these meadows. Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir are present, but they're really only on the high elevation sites. So we took a gondola up to the ski resort on the Mescalero, and that was where we were sampling some of our spruce. So yeah, complex landscape and somewhat juxtaposed species compositions. Right, so parameterization and calibration. Before anyone can use this model, we have to set it up, and this really involves two steps. It's model initialization and calibration of the model parameters. And PNet particularly requires a series of generic sort of ecoregion and species-specific parameters, and these are very physiologically heavy. And so it can be quite difficult. There are many default values that have been made available by developers, but most require calibration, based on the location of your study site. And at least for us in particular, working in the West, it's really been quite the challenge. And so saying that, I'm going to be completely honest, when I submitted my abstract, I really thought that I was going to have some, preliminary output to show you all, but I guess that just attests to the difficulty of this. And the hardest part of using physiologically parameterized model is that it's time costly, and I've definitely faced a lot of hurdles. And so to sort of not leave you, walking away without anything, my next best bet was to share kind of what I've done, some of the issues I've had, the decisions we've been making, and kind of how we're moving forward with some of these. But yeah, so it is a hard thing, and I always, being a novice land use user, I do appreciate any sort of comments and feedback. So looking at kind of the beginning, right? This is what a typical species input file looks like. You can see a lot of these sort of physiological species parameters. And really you calibrate each species before you do anything. And so when you're calibrating, you want to calibrate a species under an ideal climate stream, trying to keep as many of your parameters as, the same across species, especially, like your climate related parameters, particularly your photosynthetic optimum, which for us on this landscape was about 17 degrees Celsius. And that's kind of taken just from, normalized climate data. How we've gone about the calibration, and this is, this is something that is, you can find in the PNET user guides as well, but it's also been a lot of correspondence with, users and developers. And so really you set up your, you set up a single cell and you grow a single cohort of a species for about 250 years. And then you compare your growth outputs to simulated, growth outputs, or rather simulated wood biomass through time with growth curves that are generated in Forest Vegetation Simulator. So here's kind of like a very basic output of that. Typically, there's a lot more growth curves on this, but this is really kind of, this is for Douglas fir. We're looking at a Landis output, and the yellow line here is your FVS. And we set FVS up with a high side index, high, high density to produce that kind of happy cohort, given we're also calibrating under those optimal conditions in Landis. And you're comparing the outputs, and the goal is really not to get it to match. You're just trying to get it within reason. So, you're not having early kind of growth takeoff on that curve, and you're not, you're reaching the same amount of biomass. You're also going to look at leaf area index outputs and leaf biomass outputs and making sure those don't exceed empirical values. So once you kind of got all your species calibrated and ready to go, that's when you start playing a bit more and you're running them together on the landscape. And you start doing things, there's two parts to this. You start doing a lot of sensitivity analyses, and the other part is you start to notice a lot of problems. And so, for example, here is a output from one of my many sensitivity analyses. Here's Doug fir run with all species available on a landscape of about 2,500 hectares under different climates. So a high elevation climate, mid elevation climate, low elevation climate. And you can see kind of what's happening, with Doug fir growing under those different climate streams. And then problems, right? So the first thing that, the main issue we've been having as of recent was establishment. Many of our species were not reestablishing following senescence. And I was battling with this for quite some time until the new PNET version came out, version 4, which is now what we're using. And once I started using this, it all kind of kicked into play. And sticking to that was Douglas fir was definitely a super species on the landscape. And so we're using the newer version. We're revisiting based on suggestions from developers. We're revisiting a lot of our inputs. And so hopefully we can keep moving forward and start getting some output with this. So I know I've taken quite a bit of time, so I'm just going to quickly say thanks, Bairanki, Ngiyabonga, and Kosi. My advisors, Dr. Flake and Flatley, obviously the Mescalero and Forest Service for allowing us on their landscapes, AFI for the conference, JFSP for the tree grant, and then my sponsors and funders. And I really would appreciate any, concerns, comments, suggestions from the audience. So please feel free, happy to meet out of this session too.
Okay, thanks so much, Gabby. We don't have any questions yet in the chat. Certainly welcome them to come in. For us non-Landis users who have been scared off of it by the last two presenters, can you give us any words of encouragement?
That was not my intention. That was why I started off by saying, look how amazing it is. We can definitely use it for a lot of things. It's just it's a learning curve, especially, like I said, for not, for people who aren't natural modelers like myself.
I have a little bit of knowledge about Landis, but I think it's, just like they say, garbage in, garbage out. You have to really work on the inputs to get good input out. It's tremendously powerful, but it takes the work to make sure you're checking that that your inputs are going to give you a realistic output, right?
Right.
Well, Kevin, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'll wrap up the session for us. It looks like our plenary is going to be starting here shortly. I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers and thank you for taking the time and sharing your expertise today. For everyone who is participating, this session is recorded and it will be back up in Whova within the next 2 weeks after the Congress. Up next at